Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to resume its study on foreign election interference. Our first panel is made up of the Chief Electoral Officer and the Commissioner of Elections. For the second panel, we've got representatives from CSIS and from CSC to talk to us about security and foreign interference in Canadian elections. I would like to let the committee know that all of our virtual witnesses have done their connectivity tests and their sound tests before the start of the meeting.
Members and our guests that all comments should be made through the chair, and my understanding is that our guests today will be sharing combined 8 minutes for their opening comments, and I will commence with Mr. PROC. Welcome back to PROC.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Je me mélange toujours. J'ai avec moi Monsieur.
I have with you here Mr. Serge Caron, Deputy Chief Electoral Officer and Chief of Security Digital Transformation Sector. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to the committee about this important issue, which is the threat or the risk of foreign interference in our elections. From the outset, I'd like to specify that over the last two general elections, Elections Canada did not experience any breaches to its IT infrastructure or interference with our electoral operations. We are also unaware of efforts by foreign actors to undermine the ability of electors to vote. The expression foreign interference refers not to any particular activity, but to a source of threat which can take different forms: cyber attacks, illicit funding of candidates, parties or third parties, disinformation campaigns, even intimidation. Because of the diversity of means through which it can occur, but also because it involves state-to-state relationships, addressing foreign interference in our electoral process requires efforts by a range of agencies and departments. So today, I will talk about Elections Canada's partnerships with other agencies in this area, as well as our specific role and our governing legal framework. It is important to note that the Canada Elections Act does not define foreign interference. Rather, the Act prohibits the involvement of foreigners in our elections in specific ways that are primarily related to the political financing regime. For instance, only an individual who is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident may contribute. Foreigners are prohibited from registering as third parties, and third parties are prohibited from using foreign funds for their regulated activities. The Act also prohibits certain activities as representing, and I quote, undue influence by foreigners, such as incurring any expense to directly promote or oppose a candidate or a registered party during the election. The Act recognizes that foreigners can have some level of influence, for example, by making a statement encouraging electors to vote for a specific or against a specific candidate or registered party.
To administer election and protect them from threats irrespective of their source. This includes taking appropriate steps with the advice and support of security partners in protecting elections' IT infrastructure. Elections Canada has made significant progress in that area in recent years, and we are fortunate to be able to receive ongoing support from the Canadian Centre for Cyber Security, including close monitoring of our IT infrastructure. Another key role for Elections Canada is to ensure that electors have correct information about the electoral process. This includes information necessary to register and to vote, as well as information that allows them to trust the electoral process and its results. To counter the spread of inaccurate information about the electoral process, whether the source is foreign or domestic, Elections Canada continually monitors publicly available information. When inaccurate information is detected in news media, and the internet or on social media, it is addressed by communicating correct information. It's important to note that our focus is on content related to the voting process and electoral administration. My mandate is not to scrutinize or to police what is said about party or candidate platforms by individual or media organizations, whether domestic or foreign. Protecting the security of our elections is a team effort and requires a whole-of-government approach. Elections Canada has been actively working with a variety of Government of Canada intelligence and security agencies whose role includes detecting and responding to potential foreign interference, especially interference by state actors. These include the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Communication Security Establishment, amongst others. Together, we have developed protocols and practices for discussing threats to an election, sharing information when necessary, and ensuring that each of us is properly prepared to play our own role in the promotion of electoral security. Madam Chair, I note that the committee will be hearing from representatives of Canada's security and intelligence agencies, and of course, they will be best positioned to speak to matters relevant to their own mandate. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, de l'invitation.
Thank you. I'm delighted to present before you today. I am here by Marc Chenier, Deputy Commissioner and Chief Legal Counsel in my office.
Interference is one my office takes very seriously. As Commissioner, my role is to ensure compliance and enforcement of the Canada Elections Act. The Act provides the legal framework for the activities of my office. Activities that could be attempts of foreign interference are captured by several provisions in the Act. The wording of the obligations and prohibitions of the Act, as adopted by Parliament, determine the scope of our compliance and enforcement work. For instance, the provision on undue influence is limited to the election period and does not capture the pre-election period. Rappelons également que nous sommes une organisation.
It is important to note that we are a complaint-based organization, and we encourage Canadians to contact us when they believe there may have been a contravention of the Canada Elections Act. I would like to inform you that my office did not observe any significant change in the number of issues giving rise to complaints containing allegations of foreign interference in either the 43rd or 44th general elections. As you can imagine, cases of foreign interference can pose significant operational challenges for our work. The presence of activities, individuals, or entities from outside of our borders can significantly increase the complexity of an investigation. Of course, these challenges are not unique to our office.
My office has worked with key law enforcement and national security and intelligence organizations. This was helpful to gain a better understanding of the potential threats to elections. It has also served to ensure effective communication when appropriate during an election period. En terminant, j'aimerais
In conclusion, I wish to remind members of this committee that I am not in a position to discuss the details of files that may or may not be the subject of an investigation by my office. This includes any issues that may currently be the subject of a complaint or may have been the subject of a complaint in the past. I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Caroline.
Thank you, Ms. Caroline Simard, who is the Commissioner at the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections. We're going to start our 6-minute rounds of questions. We'll start with Mr. Cooper, and then Ms. Romanado, and then Ms. Goudreau, and Mr. Blaney. Go ahead for your 6 minutes.
Chair, thank you to the officials for being here. I want to pose my question to Mr. PROC, and I wanted to specifically ask about foreign funding of third parties. In the 2015 election, it was well established that a number of U.S.-based organizations laundered money through various entities that ended up in the hands of registered third parties. For example, nearly $800,000 of U.S.-based Tides Foundation money was transferred to the Sisu Institute Society based in British Columbia that in turn was laundered to Lead Now, which actively campaigned to defeat Conservative candidates in the 2015 election. Amendments were made to the Canada Elections Act in 2018 with Bill C-76. Would you agree that that loophole that existed at the time of the 2015 election was not fixed in Bill C-76.
Madam Chair, I do agree that there remains areas where foreign funding could find, and I'm not aware that it has, but it could find its way through third parties, and this is why I've made a recommendation to Parliament, which I'll be happy to explore with this committee in future months, regarding that potential use of foreign funding. Essentially, that loophole, if you may call it that way, relates to the ability of a third party of using their own funds. And so unless the money was provided specifically for a regulated purpose, then it would not be captured. And so what is an owned funds, and how can you address that? So I have made some recommendations, and I could expand on that today if the committee wants to hear.
But what, and I'd be interested in any recommendations that you have, but you would agree that there's nothing in the Act that would prevent U.S. money from going to a Canadian entity, to another Canadian entity, to another entity, for example, and the source of that money might be then considered Canadian.
There are opportunities for flows of money to make its way through a third party. If the party, however, has raised the money for a regulated activity, then it must disclose the source of the funding. It must be a Canadian source. The concern is with money that is received for generic or general purposes that may then later on become their own money and flow through various groups, of course, and then be used. And in this case, it becomes an expense reported as from the source of the entity itself. And so we have seen an increasing number or increasing percentage of third parties who fund their election activities by their own funds.
So in short, there are loopholes that exist with respect to third parties, and you acknowledged that in your testimony on May 28th when you appeared before this committee, when you did say there is, quote, there is, in my view, a residual opening for foreign funding through third parties, end of quote. Nothing has changed. Isn't that right? Well,
I have committed to look into this and come back with recommendations, which I have.
And one of the recommendations that you had put forward was an anti-avoidance clause?
No, it's a recommendation that groups that are funded in large degree through contributions be required to have a separate bank account where if they use money for regulated activities, it comes from that bank account and every penny comes from individual Canadians. Groups, however, that are not fundraising entities, whether it's corporations or unions, who earn money in Canada, who do not fundraise, then they would continue to be able to use their own funds, as would individuals. But if you have a fundraising entity, someone who receives money by way of contribution, then they should be regulated in a different manner. So that's an avenue that I'm putting forward to explore with this committee.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, if a foreign third party can accept foreign money, that's clear. They can accept foreign money.
They cannot accept foreign money for the purpose of regulated electoral activities.
But otherwise, if it's not specific to one of the regulated activities, then there's no limit.
Any individual in Canada is a third party, unless they're a candidate, and they may receive funds through investments or earnings from different sources, including foreign sources. That may also include contributions. So unless it's regulated, unless it's for the purpose of regulated activities, you're quite correct. People and groups in Canada receive funds from different sources.
And as you said, it could be commingled, and there's really nothing in the Act that clarifies that. And I mean, how do you really enforce? And I guess you've said set up a separate bank account. If money is ostensibly donated on the basis of an administrative purpose, and then it's commingled and used for a different purpose.
Correct. If money is given for general purposes and not specifically for regulated activity purposes, it becomes their own money, and then it can be used and reported only as their own money, even though it was a contribution. And so I think that's an issue that Parliament could choose to address in the legislation when it reviews it.
And what about an anti-avoidance clause?
Anti-avoidance, well, there are a number in the Act. I'm not aware of any prosecution, though I may be incorrect. Mr. Cheney has a long history of knowledge about these things and how effective they are. I leave that perhaps to Mr. Cheney.
Madam Chair, there's actually...
Time. Do you want the answer?
30 seconds.
Yeah, there's actually a prohibition against circumventing the prohibition against using foreign funds. So, and that was added by this committee when C-76 was before this committee.
Thank you. Madame Romanado, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Ms. Romanado, 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank the witnesses who are here with us. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Perrault very much. During your testimony, you pointed out, and I quote, that over the last 2 general elections, Elections Canada did not observe any breach of its IT infrastructure and no interference in its electoral proceedings.
And to highlight that, because there were a lot of conversations and a lot of reports that was there interference in the last 2 elections. So I want to thank you, and I understand, Madame Simard, you also mentioned that there was nothing in the last 2 elections in terms of foreign interference. One area I'd like to touch on is the pre-election period. So we hear a lot about initiatives that are happening and efforts that are made during an electoral period. But if you could elaborate about some of the work that you're doing in a pre-election period in terms of making sure that our elections are safe.
Madame la Présidente, je ne sais pas dans quelle langue on
Madam Chair, I'm not sure in which language I am to respond, but I tried to express this in my opening remarks. Foreign interference is something that can take a number of meanings. So I try to be precise when I say that we didn't experience anything at Elections Canada. Now, in the pre-electoral period, there are 2 streams of work.
The question and answer. One is working with our partners in the Government of Canada in terms of ensuring the security of election. And a lot of the work there that goes on is understanding, because people come and go between elections, making sure everyone understand who's responsible for what, who you speak to when you have an issue, what are the kinds of issues that which agency is responsible for. So it's a lot of making sure that the parameters of the mandates are understood and we have contacts. And we also receive fairly high-level briefings from the security community in terms of the overall environment. So that's one stream of work. I would include in that stream our work in terms of cybersecurity. The other one is making sure Canadians have the right information about the voting process. So that is critical for us. That's really at the core of our mandate. And so we have, for example, in the last election, put a lot of effort in our website on information about postal ballots, just because there was a concern. So how we count them, how we, what is the transparency, what are the safeguards in place to ensure the integrity of the process. So that is an important part of our work, and I think moving forward we will need to continue and expand on explaining to Canadians why they should be trustful of our elections. What are the procedures in place that we have for them?
Thank you very much. And a follow-up question to that. You mentioned the mail-in ballots. So I understand that approximately 200,000 special ballots were not returned in the last election, and obviously with COVID, a lot of people availed themselves of special ballots. Can you speak a little bit about that? There's been some comments that perhaps the results of the election would have been different had these ballots that had not been returned on time been counted, and I just would like to get your comments on that. Thank you.
So first of all, there's no indication that mail-in ballots had any swaying effect on the election in terms of their spread. I'm not aware of that. When we talk about this figure of 200,000, and sometimes people talked about uncounted ballots, these are not uncounted ballots. These are ballots that were either not received, they were not cast, and in some cases electors came and voted in person. So they had applied for a kit, but they did not send in their ballot. Or it was received late, or completed in a manner that the law directs us not to count, to set aside. So these are accounted for, and they are counted in the same way that at the polls, if a ballot is improperly marked, it is set aside. It doesn't mean that it's not counted. Okay.
Thank you for clarifying, because as you mentioned, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of these uncounted ballots, as they call them. Misinformation campaigns, you brought that up. And we've seen more and more with social media the ease in which misinformation about elections can happen. What are some of the other safeguards? I know that in your testimony you mentioned that immediately once you saw something was out there, you would counter it and say, no, actually this is in fact the situation, whether it be dates of elections or how people can vote. Can you elaborate a little bit on what else we can be doing in terms of making sure misinformation is addressed? Because the problem is it's so quick. It can go viral very quickly, whereas, we can be trying to counter and say, no, actually, this is the information. But it's almost like not believed by political parties, by candidates, by Elections Canada. What could you elaborate a little bit on what we can be doing together to make sure that people have the right information about elections, where they can vote, when they can vote, to make sure that we have maximum participation?
Certainly, Madam Chair. And the language is important. So whether it's we prefer to use language inaccurate information because we have no way of knowing whether it's misinformation or disinformation. It's simply not accurate information. And we promote the idea that Elections Canada is the trusted source of information about the electoral process. So that is something that you as candidates and your parties can do to promote. In case of doubt, turn to Elections Canada. So that, I think, is a very important aspect. So we monitor the environment, especially the social media environment. We have relationships with social media platforms. We monitor 67 platforms in 15 languages. So it's quite extensive.
And we thank you for that response. Madame Gaudreau, 6 minutes à vous.
Ms. Gaudreau, 6 minutes. 67 platforms in 15 different languages. Well, that leads me to my question. It's a little more specific because on my end, Madam Chair, it's really the disinformation and the cyber attacks that I'm concerned with, or cyber threats. First of all, I'd like to know, what are we lacking in order to work better on prevention? And I'd like to have a side note here. Are we lacking legislation, international legislation among internet providers? A number of committees have studied what the Five Eyes can do to legislate so that they can at least zero in on any cyber attack or threats, or even disinformation. I'd like to hear what you have to say, both of you, on this. Is this a tool that we're going to have to really think about using upstream before asking everybody to file complaints one after the other? Go ahead, please, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. Thank you for the question from Madame Gaudreau. Yes. Currently, there are tools that allow me and my office to do the investigative work. So it's important to understand the distinction between our roles. Our role is that of observation and enforcement of the Act. In this spirit, as you know, there are tools that were adopted, new provisions that came into effect in 2019 for the most part. So with time, this will have an effect. And we have received complaints on foreign interference. There haven't been formal measures applied. But to answer your question more specifically, as for recommendations, I will hand it over to my Deputy Commissioner Chenier to give you a few more pointers on this. As Commissioner Simard mentioned, a number of measures or provisions were adopted, and this reinforced the system and reduced the possibility for foreign money to enter the system. In terms of foreign interference, we're limited as to what our office can do around those provisions. So what are you lacking? Or, we're talking about that right now, so tell us. There is a recommendation that was made by Ms. Simard's predecessor, Mr. Cote. He recommended that what's defined as undue influence in the Act should include a third aspect. Currently in the Act, there's mention of incurring expenses or breaking a provincial or federal law when somebody carries out an activity that promotes or discourages a candidate. What would be preferable, according to Mr. Cote, is to protect the freedom of expression in political debates, so that this right of freedom of expression and protecting political dialogue be clear, so that when we're talking about voluntary foreign interference, it creates confusion among people. And so he recommended that there be a third way to interpret this undue influence. And the person or the foreign entity, it's when a foreign entity voluntarily plays this role. To be more precise in my question, Madam Chair, if there were rules among G7 countries that defined what was acceptable and unacceptable, whether that be on platforms where one doesn't give their consent to juvenile pornography and so on, could this be something that helps you? Because the objective is to find out what we need to focus on with our measures. Mr. Perrault. Well, I've got a few recommendations that have to do with this. First of all, the most important thing is to have more transparency around digital platforms. So understanding social media and their policies around electoral policies and the way the information is treated on this question of elections. Now, there is media and social media oversight. When we see information that, in our opinion, is disinformation or inaccurate, we can alert them. We have protocols in place with these large platforms. Now, as for them, they will deal with this based on their policies, but we don't know what their policies are. So we need to, in the very least, have transparency around what their policies are. They can establish their own, but they need to at least disclose them. I think that would help to establish trust. And there are also some recommendations around reinforcing rules on disinformation. But I would start first and foremost with transparency. Thank you. How much time do I have left? 30 seconds. Okay, a quick, simple question. Madam Chair, why is the Commissioner only focusing on the electoral period for receiving or for performing oversight on everything that has to do with interference? Well, to follow up on what was said, there isn't a single provision in the Act that deals with this. I think you're referring to the one that deals with undue influence, and there is a recommendation that was made by the Chief Electoral Officer, and my predecessor supported it, and that would be that the period be expanded and not limited to the electoral period, so include the pre-electoral period. Thank you very much. I'd like to everybody know that you can speak in the official language of your choice at any time. Even if the question came in one language, you can respond in the language that you're most comfortable with. Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses here today. It's always important for us to talk about our election process and what we're doing to make sure we're protecting it from foreign threats. One of the biggest hurdles that I think all of us know is us as elected officials and in positions such as yours is getting people to trust the system. And I think that's becoming increasingly hard with so much misinformation. And we've seen recently, of course, what happened in the U.S., which was really a deliberate attempt to undermine the electoral system and make something that was concrete seem like it wasn't. And that was very concerning, and I know all of us are watching that and watching the outcomes of what happens when foreign entities abuse misinformation. So I'm just wondering, and I place this question, of course, through the chair to both of you, how can we ensure that accurate, reliable information is shared here in Canada so that misinformation isn't taken advantage of by foreign entities? And I leave it to the two of you.
Well, I think, Madam Chair, it starts with seeding the environment with correct information, and that's a big part of our work. Preparing for an election is to build a repository of information about the voting process that, whether it's the media, the candidates, the parties can turn to understand what will the rules be, what will the procedures be. The second thing is to monitor what's being said out there and to focus on information about the voting process. That's my mandate, and to respond to any misinformation or inaccurate information by pushing out their corrected information. And if there is the appearance of an attempt to interfere with the voting process, I can refer that to the Commissioner for investigation. But my role is to make sure that Canadians have correct information about the voting process. I have made some recommendations about expanding the rules on disinformation in my recommendations report, and I'd be happy to speak more about that.
Alors peut-être d'un point de vue pratique.
Perhaps from a practical point of view around compliance and law enforcement, for platforms, it's important that you know that there's dialogue that is started between my office and the platforms. This dialogue, up until now, has been very positive. Some content has been removed from platforms following our request. And the proof, the evidence was preserved and communicated, so that's part of our investigations. I'm not talking only about foreign interference. This is, in general, as part of our investigations.
So just to go back to that idea, I guess I'm curious about methods that are being looked at in terms of reporting on which communities are the most vulnerable. And so what I mean by that is I know that, for example, Indigenous communities where there's often a sense of distrust already or could be more vulnerable to misinformation around how to vote, what the process is. We also know new Canadians who may not be able to access information through English and French. And the other part that I would also add is I think rural communities can be under a particular level of concern because of their remoteness. Often they don't have access to information as readily as other people. So I'm just wondering, in the work that is being done, how are those communities being considered around those particular vulnerabilities, especially in this area of foreign threats? Because I think there's a unique situation there that needs to be addressed. So just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, Madam Chair, I think it's a very important point. We know that there are communities in Canada that have a knowledge gap about our political institutions. They don't know as much as they perhaps should or could about the voting process and our institutions' work, and that does make them more vulnerable. So our outreach activities are geared towards communities that have a knowledge barrier in terms of our voting process. We are, for example, right now working on a pilot project with Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario to build a civic education program specifically for Indigenous Canadians. So that's a pilot, and we'll learn from that and see how we can expand it. But we have a range of outreach activities that aim specifically at bridging that gap for certain communities. And you're quite right to point this out, that it does make those Canadians, new Canadians, different groups, more susceptible to be vulnerable to disinformation.
So just so you know, this is not a part of comprise within our mandate of compliance and enforcement.
Okay, thank you. So we know that election interference is not just a Canadian problem. So I'm just wondering, from what other jurisdictions is Election Canada learning lessons about protecting the integrity of elections, and what lessons are being learned?
Yes, again, Madam Chair, good question. We do work with international partners. One of our good partners is Australia. They had in their most recent election a registry of misinformation. So they would have that registry that would publish false statements about the electoral process that people can refer to. And they felt that it was a valuable addition to their program, and we're looking into something that could be similar for our election. So we are exchanging. At the end of the month, I will be attending a meeting of the OAS, the Organizations for American States. I expect to meet there people from Brazil, from the United States, from other American jurisdictions to deal with these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Calkins, followed by Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just confirm with me, if you can, Mr. Perot, there's approximately 17 million people who voted in the last federal election. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Given the result from the last election, the Liberal Party of Canada, which is now the government, fell, I believe, on election night 11 ridings short of a majority. Would you say that that's correct?
I believe that's correct.
If you look at the closest 11, and I'll just say 13 because a few people have, there was some things that happened afterwards, but I'll just say for the sake of 13 ridings. The 13 ridings is the number of ridings that the Conservative Party consequently asked about foreign interference in. But in the closest 13 ridings that the Liberal Party could have won, the difference between their candidate winning and the person who did win, in my estimation, just falls a little over 20,000 votes. So out of 17 million votes cast, the difference between a majority and a minority government in this country was 0.1% of the ballots cast. How easy is it for a foreign state actor to move the needle 0.001% in this country?
So I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know what is the effectiveness of any interventions, be they domestic or foreign. I have to say that's one aspect of the work that we do, is that we're not equipped to distinguish when we're seeing, for example, debates on social media, criticism of a candidate or a party, and we do see some of that. We have no means of ascertaining whether that criticism is originating from a foreign source or a domestic source, and whether it's a legitimate part of the electoral process or an attempt from foreign interference. That's something that belongs to the national security agencies. But beyond that, it's hard to ascertain what would be the impact. I recognize the challenge here. How do we determine whether any aspect of that would have an impact?
So my former colleague, Kenny Chu, who lost in the last election, was, prior to the election, very vocally critical of the things that were happening in Hong Kong, and he has alleged quite publicly that that the Chinese Communist Party, using software that might not be physically available to everybody to see, but using chat groups and so on, these chat groups can get quite large, involving tens of thousands of people. In light of the fact that we've actually had people report in this country about unofficial Chinese Communist Party police stations or enforcement stations operating in certain parts of the country, how reasonable would it be to assume that these kinds of things are happening so covertly that we wouldn't be aware of them actually happening or their significance?
It's quite possible that some of that is happening, and that is a matter of concern. And I think that's why we have national security agencies to look into these matters. I do not have that mandate or capacity to look into that. That said, if there are offenses under the Act, there are complaints that are referred to the Commissioner, or the Commissioner receives complaints that fall within the parameters of the legislation, then there are ways for our office to look into that. But in terms of our agency, it's very difficult to ascertain to what extent there is foreign activity to influence the election.
You said in your opening remarks that Canadian intelligence services, both CSIS and the security establishment, have been in contact, or you are in contact with them. They obviously discuss things with you. What can you share with this committee? What can you publicly share with this committee insofar as your instincts towards the information that you've received from our security establishments?
So prior to the election, we received briefings that inform at a general level of the tradecraft of certain countries and the interest that some countries may have in our Canadian elections. It's a fairly high level information, and they would inform us of anything that is actionable for us. The understanding is that if there is something that relates to the voting process, for instance, that I need to know in order to run the election, then I would need to be made aware of that. I've not been made aware of any of that, any activities in that regard. But beyond that, they are the ones who are concerned with foreign interference.
So just a quick question. Would the returning to enumeration help you, help your organization improve the integrity of the election system?
No, not at all. I think very clearly moving to enumeration would deteriorate the integrity of the election.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Thank you. Mrs. Sahoda.
I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today once again to help strengthen our democracy. My first question is either to the Office of the Commissioner or Elections Canada, really. Through this site task force that has been created, you are a party of that, and even though it may not be your role to collect the information. I'm sure that at least at a high level, you are all briefed about the different threats and the nature of those threats that happen. From a report from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, that report on foreign interference threats to Canada's democratic process in 2021 said that although Canada's electoral system is strong, ongoing foreign interference threats threatens the integrity of the democratic institution and the Canadians' trust in them. It covers foreign interference in different techniques, which go from cybersecurity to elicitation, cultivation, coercion, illicit and corrupt financing. We have been made aware through different reports that when it comes to cybersecurity, countries like Russia, China, Iran are some of the top offenders. What other countries are involved in more of these covert operations that you have been informed about, other than those three?
So I think you've named the countries that come to my mind. I'm sure you'll be hearing from the security agencies that follow us. So, but I don't have any additional information for the committee.
No other countries have ever been mentioned other than these three in your, or you've been made aware of that there's been operations on the ground?
Top of mind, I don't recall. I want to be careful. It's difficult to remember if you have something that's sensitive or not, and so I would not want to put out there any information that I should not be sharing publicly. But quite frankly, there are no countries other than that come to mind.
So maybe perhaps we're saying these are the publicly known threats. However, you may be informed of other countries' involvement, but you may not be able to share that information with us here today. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, and perhaps I should add that, the source of a threat is something that is difficult to ascertain, whether it's misinformation or cyber, and I'll let the cyber experts speak to that. But it's something that during an event is not immediately apparent. So you're seeing incorrect information, whether it's mis or dis, whether it's foreign, whether it's domestic. It's just incorrect information, and we need to deal with it. And the same is true from our perspective with cyber attacks. We need to have walls. We need to have protections. Now, in terms of who's behind those cyber attacks, this is of interest, of course, to Canada. But in terms of our role, the important thing is that we protect our infrastructure.
Not just cyber attacks, but other types of operations that could be influencing. If not other countries, could you state that there are perhaps other third parties or entities that are located in other countries that come top of mind to you?
I'm not aware of any, no, Madam Chair.
Okay. My next question is about social media companies. Many social media companies have signed the Declaration on Electoral Integrity, which commits, among other things, to address disinformation. We know that algorithmic transparency is an issue when it comes to these social media companies. And a lot of those algorithms originate from the U.S. Many of these social media companies originate from there as well. What impact do you think that has in terms of being considered foreign influence on elections?
So again, this is a bit of a laced question. Je vais le dire en français, c'est peut-être plus simple pour moi. Il faut faire
It'll be easier for me to say it in French. You have to be careful. The fact that there are activities happening abroad does not necessarily mean interference. Interference in the sense of the Electoral Act refers to offenses that are very specific. So it's difficult to untangle all the elements of your question. What I would say is that I think that we would do good to improve confidence of Canadians in elections so that we know what the policies are of these social media companies and platforms. As for treating or dealing with inaccurate information, well, currently it's a black box. We have protocols in place to deal with concerns, but we don't have the transparency we wish we did in order to reassure people that measures have been taken to diminish the impact of disinformation or inaccurate information.
Out of time, but I just want to thank you for all your hard work in making sure our elections are run fairly and smoothly.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demie.
2 minutes.
Ms. Goudreau, 2.5 minutes. Okay, a few very specific questions for you, Madam Chair. This is for the Commissioner. When you spoke and said that your work, in fact, your mandate is mostly to focus on complaints from the public, I'm wondering if there are no complaints, well then, what does your oversight look like? I imagine you have inspected or analyzed things, but if there are no complaints, what do you do? Because earlier you said that there was interference, but there hadn't been any complaints over the last 2 elections. Well, to answer that question, Madam Chair, indeed, there is a discretionary power that is granted to me through the Act. It's important that we take measures within that discretion. I think that it's important to note that in the past, this discretion was exercised. You have that information in the public reports published by my predecessor. And yes, that's what I would say for now. Thank you. Now, when you talk about the presence of activities or entities beyond our borders contributing to significantly increasing the level of complexity of an investigation. So, Madam Chair, I'd like to know, when we're talking about complexity, because we're here to help you, what do you need? Our mandate, as I said, as laid out in the Act, gives us tools and lets us do our work. What's important to understand is that our mandate is limited to those provisions and to that framework, and we have to work in collaboration with partners. That's what we're already doing, and we're going to continue doing that. And what I would say is that you're asking how we can improve that. Well, there's a recommendation that was made by my predecessor as well, and it had to do with the definitions and terms used in the Act. And the Deputy Commissioner could talk to you a little more about that. Since I only have a few seconds left, I would encourage you, because you can see what we're asking for here, can you please submit those answers? And when it is time for Mr. Perrault, well, to work on those issues with Australia and Brazil and so on, we'd love to have that. Thank you very much. So that's a great invitation, and that is an invitation to everyone. You can share information with the committee. You can share it through the clerk. Ms. Blaney, 2.5 minutes.
Madam Chair, and of course through you, I guess my last question to both of you is really on the pre-election period. We're hearing a lot more about the due diligence that needs to be done in the pre-election period, and I think we can't ever underestimate how foreign influence will come through the process. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what would be more beneficial around the pre-election period in terms of the services that you provide, and how could that assist us in building trust in Canadians for the systems that we have here for our elections. Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, if I may, I think it's important for us to increasingly talk about what we do to protect the integrity of our electoral process. I think this is something that we certainly begun in the last election. I do think it was quite successful. We had a lot of information about postal ballots because of the concerns that were there. But I think it's also important to go beyond that and to explain to Canadians why they should trust elections. And we do have extraordinary safeguards in our procedures, and it is a very transparent process if only they knew more about it. So I think we do have a responsibility to share that information with the Canadian population, of course, through the media and through MPs and candidates. So that, I think, to me, is certainly a way forward when we talk about work between elections, so that we seed the ground with healthy information about the voting process, and not let the space be filled by conspiracy theories or inaccurate information.
Moi, je vous répondrai que c'est important de recevoir des...
I would answer that it's important to receive complaints. Canadians need to submit complaints. For your information, for the last general election, we received 13 situations for 16 complaints around foreign interference for 14,000 files. So it's important that Canadians communicate with us. And as for complexity, for investigations, we need to have evidence. We work with tangible information, so we need to receive that tangible information. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. And I think my time is wrapping up, but I will say again that it is by interacting with our systems that we build trust. So I think it is important for the pre-election component. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will direct my question to whoever is in a position to answer. The Canada Elections Act prohibits a third party from using foreign funds for regulated purposes, as you noted. So let me just give you a hypothetical. A third party can spend $1.5 million. They receive $1.5 million from domestic sources, and a U.S. entity donates $1.5 million, and then they spend $1.5 million in an election. What happens?
So they may, well, it's a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical. We'd have to look at, we may not have a window on the historical assets of that third party. They don't, third parties are anybody in Canada that is not a registered party, electoralistic association, or candidate. Essentially, they're everybody. And so we don't have visibility on the history of their assets. They do need to report, and that was an improvement brought in 20.
Well, but they need to report funds or monies that are spent for the regulated purposes, right?
Correct, but they
So then what's the enforcement mechanism?
Well, if they report that they have used of that $1.5 million, and very few of them do reach that amount, to be clear, the vast majority spend small amounts. But if they do report having spent vast amounts, they will have to report the source of the expenditure, the funding for that money. And a significant portion could be their own funds. And so we have no mechanism.
Those funds could be foreign funds.
Those funds could be foreign funds. And that's why I've made recommendations that they need, that third parties.
Even though the Act says there's a prohibition on the use of foreign funds, what you're saying is that really doesn't mean much of anything.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I say it's incomplete. I think until we have a grasp on the use of one entity's own funds, I think the Act is incomplete and it needs to be addressed.
I want to just ask a question. You mentioned that there were no significant change of a number of issues giving rise to complaints containing allegations of foreign interference in either the 43rd or 44th election. I think, Madame Simard, you mentioned that. What are the numbers, though? You said there wasn't a significant increase, but what are the numbers?
I asked my, the Deputy Commissioner to answer this question. Thank you.
I believe for the 43rd general election, there were 10 complaints involving some component that could be foreign interference. And for the last general election, there were 13. And again, those are allegations. They, in many cases, they don't fall within the prohibited conduct in the Act. So it depends, again, on what the prohibited conduct is and what the allegation is. And often we just cannot do anything with a complaint.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Cooper, I enjoy having you on this committee. You always give me time back, so I appreciate that. Mr. Turnbull, 4 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Perot, maybe I'll start with you, and good to see you again. In response to Ms. Blaney's comment about misinformation, and I think you indicated that you're constantly monitoring that and that you're putting out sort of corrective messages to correct that misinformation that's out there. Obviously, this is a concern to all of us. The prevalence of mis and disinformation out there is quite troubling. But would you like to comment perhaps on the impact of parties that sometimes attack or undermine our democratic institutions, like Elections Canada? How does that impact their ability or your ability to be the trusted source for information?
So it's a very generic question. I'll respond, Madam Chair, very generically. I think I welcome the support of all parties to reinforce the trust in the electoral press. I think it's a partnership that we have with Canadians to make sure that people trust the electoral process. And if parties have concerns about aspects of the electoral process, then of course there should be debate about that, and there are avenues for that. But it is critical that we all work together to reinforce our democratic institutions.
So, and Mr. Perot, you said that in your opening remarks that there was no foreign interference in the last 2 general elections, which is great to hear. How do you know that?
Well, I said there was no breaches of our IT infrastructure, so that I know for a fact. For instance, we do have cyber attacks every day, like every institution. Okay, we have no mechanism of knowing whether they're foreign or domestic, and I'm assuming that a large part of that is foreign, but that we're not specifically targeted. But we have had no breach, and we have had no interference with our operations. That is not to say that there's not a foreign interest in Canadian elections and the political debates and the political outcomes, but these are areas that ultimately go beyond the reach of Elections Canada.
And I guess when talking about pre-election periods in a minority parliament, they're sort of, I think, a little bit more extended. And I'm interested in how our democracy was attempted to, or the undermining of it was attempted during the convoy that we saw. And we did see and hear media reports multiple times that there was a significant amount of funding that was coming across the border into and supporting that convoy, which had a stated attempt to overthrow the government and was really trying to undermine policies that a democratically elected government had been elected to implement. So I'm wondering if you can make any comments on how we can protect against that. It's a form of foreign and domestic interference. I would say it's foreign-sponsored domestic interference, and it's pre-election. But what are we doing in that area?
This is an issue that's much broader than electoral administration. Certainly, we do monitor beyond the election period what is said about the voting process. So if there was incorrect information on the voting process during the convoy or at any other any other circumstance, we would respond to that. The point you made about foreign funding, I read the papers as we all do. I don't have any definite knowledge of the source of the funding of the convoy, but certainly it's an illustration. Should there be foreign funding of a group or of an individual, we need to have measures to prevent foreign funding from seeping into the activities of third parties. I think there's agreement. I hear certainly agreement across the.
Thank you, Mr. Perot.
Excellent. That brings us to an end for our time together for the first panel. And so we do want to thank Madame Simard, Mr. Perot, Mr. Caron, as well as Mr. Chenier for joining us today. If you have any additional information that you would like to share with our committee on this study, please do share it with the clerk, and we'll make sure it is shared with all members. With that, I thank you for the tremendous work you do, and I wish you a good day. We're good?
Second panel is ready. I'd like to resume our meeting.
For the second panel, Michelle Tessier, Deputy Director Operations with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, also known as CSIS. And we have Madame Alia Tayeb, Deputy Chief of Signals Intelligence with the Communications Security Establishment, also known as CSE. We will be starting with 4 minutes of opening comments, starting with Madame Tessier, and then we will continue with Madame Tayeb, you sharing your comments. Welcome to PROC. Madame Tessier, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. As was mentioned, my name is Michelle Tessier, and I am the Deputy Director of Operations for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Merci de votre invitation pour comparaître.
Thank you for the invitation to brief you on this topic today, because we are talking about interference threats to elections, foreign interference threats to elections.
Foreign interference is and what it is not. Foreign interference is not the normal diplomatic and public relations activity that is carried out by foreign states to influence policy outcomes. Those activities, when they take place overtly, are acceptable activities in Canada, even when conducted vigorously. They are not foreign interference. Les activités d'ingérence étrangère sont différentes.
Foreign interference activities are different. They cross a line. They attempt to undermine our democratic processes or threaten our citizens.
Parliament defined foreign influenced activities, which is another term for foreign interference, as, and I quote, activities within or related to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person, end quote. To be clear, foreign interference is a covert and malign activity undertaken by a foreign state to advance its national interests to the detriment of Canada's interests, and often targets Canadians, as well as our democratic institutions and processes. These activities take aim at Canada's economy, policy process, communities, and media. Today, we are discussing how foreign interference impacts our democracy. It targets all levels of government, be it federal, provincial, or municipal, as well as political parties, candidates, elected officials and their staff, and elections themselves. States may seek to influence who becomes an official candidate and even electoral outcomes. Indeed, individuals may be threatened or made to fear reprisals if they fail to comply with publicly supporting a particular candidate or contributing funds to a foreign state's preferred party or candidate. While state actors may use coercive techniques to achieve their objectives, they may also use flattery, promise compensation, or appeal to an individual's sense of pride towards another country to elicit the desired behavior. We're also increasingly seeing states leverage media, including more traditional and community-based media, in addition to social media, to spread disinformation or run influence campaigns designed to confuse or divide public opinion, interfere in healthy public debate and political discourse. As a member of the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, known as SITE, CSIS worked closely with partners in efforts to raise awareness and assess foreign interference threats against the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. This included providing classified intelligence briefings on foreign interference to cleared political party members. Both in 2019 and in 2021, the panel of senior civil servants responsible for the critical election instant public protocol determined that the Government of Canada did not detect foreign interference that threatened Canada's ability to have a free and fair election, and that warranted public communication. Last year, ahead of the 2021 federal election, CSIS released a public report on foreign interference threats to Canada's democratic process to better inform Canadians of this serious threat. As this report shows, foreign states target our democratic process to covertly influence Canadian public policy, public opinion, and ultimately undermine our democracy. But there are ways to help protect against this threat. Our report communicates some strategies Canadians can take to identify and resist foreign interference. Both the RCMP and CSIS have phone numbers and online reporting mechanisms that are monitored 24/7 for anyone who would like to report a threat to national security, including foreign interference.
Thank you, Ms. Tessier. 4 minutes flies by. Madame Tayeb, over to you.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for this invitation to appear today. My name is Alia Tayeb. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Signals Intelligence for the Communications Security Establishment. CSE is Canada's national cybersecurity and foreign intelligence agency. J'ai l'honneur d'être ici aujourd'hui avec ma collègue.
I am pleased to be here today with my colleague Michel Tessier from CSIS. Today I will provide you with an update from CSE's perspective on the threat of foreign interference to our electoral system.
Some of the key trends we've observed, and to complement Michelle's remarks, we'll focus on what we see from a cyber perspective. On Friday, we published our National Cyber Threat Assessment, more commonly known as the NCTA. The NCTA highlights that online foreign influence activities have become the new normal, with adversaries seeking to influence elections and impact international discourse related to current events. We assess that misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, or MDM, propagated by state-sponsored cyber threat actors, represents an ongoing, persistent threat to Canadians. Adversary states constantly circulate and amplify MDM that supports their interests. Further, we've seen state-sponsored cyber threat activity is impacting Canadians by targeting both individuals and Canada's economy at large. Individuals are targeted, including diaspora populations and activists in Canada. They may also target Canadians' personal information. Another method state-sponsored actors utilize is targeting Canada's economic value, and this may be done through intellectual property theft and foreign intelligence operations. Comme le Canada participe activement à la communauté.
Canada's active participation in the international community and membership in key organizations such as NATO and the G7 almost certainly make Canadians a target for online foreign influence campaigns. Between 2015 and 2020, the vast majority of cyber threat activity affecting democratic processes could be attributed to state-sponsored cyber threat actors. Russia, China, and Iran were very likely responsible for most of the foreign state-sponsored cyber threat activity against democratic processes worldwide.
Prevent and defend against these threats. We collect foreign intelligence on the activities of foreign states, including any foreign interference activities directed at Canada's democratic institutions or processes. We provide cybersecurity and information assurance, including providing advice and defenses against malicious state actors who may seek to use cyber as a tool for foreign interference. For example, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, we have observed numerous Russian-backed disinformation campaigns online, including those designed to discredit and spread disinformation about NATO allies and false narratives about Canada's involvement in the conflict. We shared this information on Twitter as part of the Government of Canada's efforts to help inform Canadians. In addition, we can conduct active and defensive cyber operations to disrupt hostile activities from foreign states, which could include disrupting foreign interference activities. And we also provide technical and operational assistance to CSIS and the RCMP as they seek to identify, prevent, and disrupt foreign interference. Le CST et son centre de cybersécurité.
The CSE and its Cyber Centre have also worked directly with Elections Canada for several years, providing cybersecurity advice and guidance. This partnership continues today, and we continue to support their efforts to ensure secure elections.
Threats to Elections Task Force, or SITE. So, for short, I'll only briefly outline CSE's role in the SITE. In the lead up and during the 2021 federal election, CSE, CSIS, Global Affairs Canada, and the RCMP worked together closely as part of the SITE task force to monitor for foreign threats and interference with electoral processes in Canada. Mis à part le contexte des élections, notre
Outside the context of an election, our intelligence work continues and provides insights to partners with respect to foreign interference. And our cybersecurity work continues to prevent and defend against cyber intrusions that could enable foreign interference.
Time flies, I know. But we look forward to hearing more from you during the question and answer periods. And we will start with 6 minutes to Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Culkins, welcome. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I really do appreciate your testimony, and it begs more questions than I have, so I'll just get straight to it. The Communist Party of China passed the National Intelligence Law in 2017, which requires Chinese organizations and citizens anywhere in the world to assist with the Communist Party's in state intelligence work. Would you agree with that?
Madam Chair, perhaps I can answer that question. Yes, we absolutely do agree with that.
In September, an article in the Globe and Mail exposed extensive network of Chinese police stations operating not only in Canada, but also in other democratic nations around the world. And we also know that the Government of Canada had to limit the Chinese Communist Party's use of Operation Fox Hunt in 2015 due to fears that it was used to intimidate dissidents in Canada. So I guess my question to you is, what measures are your organizations taking ongoing to monitor this threat, and how, I don't know if you followed the line of questioning I had in the previous, with the previous guests, but 17 million Canadians cast a ballot in the last election. The difference between a majority Liberal government and a minority Liberal government was 13, and the 13 closest ridings was a mere 20-some thousand votes. And I guess I'm going to ask you, even though this might not be directly related to your mandate, but do foreign state actors, which I think pose a different threat than third-party funding coming from other countries, can foreign actors move the needle 20 to 30,000 votes during a federal election campaign?
Perhaps, Madam Chair, I can begin and certainly turn to my colleague as well for any comments Alia may have. Thank you for the question. If I address the initial question about the overseas police stations, as I'm sure you can appreciate, I can't go into the details, the operational details of the service's work, but I can say that we're using all of the authorities that we have to look at any potential threat to our communities. And it is very important for us to be able to ensure that our communities in Canada feel protected and are not the victims of any threat action towards them or any foreign actor trying to threaten them or their families back home, which we know is of concern. And so obviously this remains a priority for us. In terms of foreign state actors influencing any elections, I'm not at liberty to say whether or not certain numbers could be influenced that way. But what I can say, and as we have said in our public reports and through other venues, we are very concerned about foreign influence activities against our democratic institutions, against our elections, and we do see these activities increasing. So it is working with our stakeholders and other Government of Canada partners to increase the awareness about this threat.
In 2019, it was discovered that a spy from the Chinese Communist government was recruited to run a constituency of an Australian parliamentarian. And despite our geographic distance from China, there are worries that China interferes with our politics here domestically, of course. I'll use an example, former Ambassador John McCallum's intervention on behalf of Meng Wanzhou, as well as China praising Canadian senators that voted against the Uyghurs genocide motion. So I guess I'm going to ask you, are there current parliamentarians or senators, or are there volunteers in various campaigns, or are there staff members working for members of Parliament or senators that Parliament should be made aware of, that it could potentially be compromised? And if there are any, how would you communicate that, and who would get to know that?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my opening comments, we are very concerned about the targeting. We know that there is certainly a desire to target elected officials at all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal. And we do work at providing defensive briefings and are certainly encourage individuals who have any concerns or questions to reach out to us, because we do engage quite a bit in stakeholder awareness and in defensive briefings when these types of concerns are raised.
In order to mitigate, sorry, Ms. Taib, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I just thought that what I would do is I wanted to echo what Michelle was saying in that regard. We work very closely, and we did, as part of the site task force as well, in the lead up to the election, the 4 agencies together to ensure that we were providing regular briefings to political parties. We also work very closely with the House of Commons to ensure that any and all information that we should be sharing with them by way of threat information about foreign interference is done so. Thank you.
So given the nature of your comments, Ms. Tessier, in regards to the increased level of foreign state interference, and you talked about the tools that you have available to you, are there any tools that you, any new tools or any other authorities that you think you would need, either of you, would need in order to continue to protect Canada's democratic institutions?
We have highlighted in the past that we feel that the CSIS Act was written at a time, 1984, that has likely not kept up with the modern complex threat landscape as well as technological advances. And so we are constantly looking at our authorities and at the tools we require. One example I would give is our ability to use data and to assess data. We are in a world of increased data, and although changes were made to the CSIS Act to enable us to look at data and manage data sets, we still feel that, again, with evolving technology and our authorities, there's probably discussion to be had in terms of CSIS's ability to assess data. Another example.
Sorry, I know our time flies by so quickly. We can always, you can always provide us this information, especially when it comes to input that we should be aware of to help you do the important work that you do. Mr. Turnbull, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to both our witnesses for being with us today. Found your opening remarks really helpful. Ms. Tessier, I'll start with you. So in your opening remarks, you said that CSIS did not detect foreign interference that needed to be disclosed. And I think just going back to the critical incident election public protocol, it sounds like that wasn't used, or that, and I wondered if you could just speak to the fact that there can be a potential threat that did not meet the threshold under that protocol. Can you explain that a little bit more for the committee?
Certainly. As we've mentioned, and I believe there will be members of the site task force appearing later this week, we as well as other government partners such as CSC, Global Affairs Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we participate in site. And it is really a combination of all our intelligence that is used to inform the critical panel if there is any type of foreign interference that we feel could potentially affect the integrity of the overall election. And in this case, there was not, but that is the work that we do on a constant basis. And the site group does brief the panel on a regular basis in terms of the incidents that we see during an electoral period.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So we can probably infer from that that there are potential threats in our electoral process. It's just that they're not going to impact have a material or make a material difference on the election integrity. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, we as we've mentioned, we do see activity of foreign interference or attempts of foreign interference, attempts of trying to influence, but not enough to have met the threshold of impacting the overall electoral integrity.
Thank you. And I'll go to Ms. Tahib now. Many social companies have signed what's called the Declaration on Electoral Integrity, which commits, among other things, for them to address MDM, as you call it. And we know that algorithmic transparency is an issue. It's been talked about quite often. And the algorithms that they use predominantly originate, as far as I understand, from U.S., i.e. foreign-based companies. What impact, Ms. Tahib, do you think this has in terms of being considered foreign influence on an election?
Thank you very much for that question. We do work very closely with social media companies really all around the world, and we did so in a collaborative fashion as part of the site task force as well. In terms of addressing your question about the U.S. origin of those algorithms, we definitely work with U.S. companies as well. We will advise them of any information or any interference that we suspect to have taken place. We have a very collaborative relationship with them. They've been very open to addressing those concerns. They have very, as you pointed out, robust policies in and around proper use of those platforms, and we've found them very responsive to that. I think maybe I'll just clarify, when we here at CSC are looking at foreign interference and foreign influence activities, we're mostly looking at state actor activities, which is not to say that a foreign organization couldn't also be engaged in such activities. But in the case of the US, we've found very strong partnerships with those companies, and we've been able to work with them in a collaborative fashion. Thank you.
Great. And recently, one of the concerns that sort of stands out in my mind is Canada Proud tweeted at Elon Musk hours after he became the owner of Twitter to ask about C11, which we know was a source of significant disinformation in the last election. So what role do social media companies have in being responsible actors during and leading up to elections?
Shall I reply to that one?
I'm sorry. Yes, I was directing that to you, Ms. Teeb.
Absolutely, and I apologize, and I'll leave some room for Michelle to answer if you have anything else to add. We think they play a very strong role in this domain. I think as practitioners in the security and intelligence community, it's important for us not to be seen to be interfering at all in what is healthy discourse, even when we don't like it. And so we definitely see activities that are not foreign state directed as being well within the purview of responsible industry to take care of. We certainly are, our role in that is to advise them, provide them the information that they need in order to protect themselves and to protect their audiences. But absolutely believe that they are well placed to address those threats. Thank you.
Thanks. And Ms. Tessier, would you like to add anything?
No, I find Alia answered quite well. I would just reiterate that we work in a democracy, and managing social media, knowing that it is very much a tool used by foreign actors, is, of course, of concern, and encouraging awareness, encouraging liaison with these platforms so that they recognize foreign interference and are able to act on it.
And would you say, Ms. Tahib, that the majority of the MDM that's out there is propagated through social media?
Certainly, I would say that that is a very large vector that we have in society these days. I think it's not exclusive to social media, but certainly since the very robust propagation of social media throughout our society, we've absolutely seen an increase in those types of activities.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Ms. Goudreau, 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our witnesses. I'm learning a lot. Because from the outset, well, you noticed that we have the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner of Canada Elections, and there was one question that I'd like to ask you as well, then I'll have a few others. Currently, on the legislative level, your oversight is critical, but it's also preventive, and it helps solve problems. We hope we don't have to solve such problems, but that's the case. When we talk about the country, is there a lack of rules within the legislation governing internet platforms? This is a subject we've been talking about for years now. There have been discussions, meetings with the Five Eyes, but currently there's no sign of possible legislation among parties, whether it's with Five Eyes or the G7 countries. So I'd like to hear you talk about the importance of collaborating on this to work better, one after the other, please, Madam Chair. Thank you. Perhaps I can start. Thank you for the question. What's sure is that we are continually looking at this. As was said, technology evolves, laws, the complexity of the environment evolves. So we're constantly in discussion with other departments of the Government of Canada and with our allies as well, so that we can understand what would be useful for the country. Of course, we respect that decisions around acts and policy changes fall within, politics. So we provide our recommendations and advice, but of course we respect that jurisdictional element. Now, we definitely keep abreast of what can be useful for us here in Canada. We base that on experiences, lived by others. Thank you for that question. I'll speak in English to be more precise.
With what Michelle said, our authorities are in a constant state of evolution, and we do have very robust engagement with partners across a government in order to make sure that they have the information that we collect with respect to foreign threats to Canadian electoral processes, but also in terms of manipulation of societal dialogue. That said, regulation in that vein is not the purview of CSE. We'd be happy to provide advice to our government colleagues, but we ourselves don't have a part in the regulation of telecommunications or social media. Thank you.
Merci. Tout de même.
Thank you. You reassured me more or less when you talked about interference around elections. Well, I've heard of, clandestine activities and flattery and so on. I would like to hear what you have to say. I mean, for the sake of discussion, what we're experiencing in the cyber world in the decades to follow, does that represent a concern for you? If we look at it from a macro perspective, cyber threats, I'd like to hear what you have to say. I could start, Michelle.
Perspective, certainly we do see our adversaries are very well-resourced. They're dedicated to their strategic interests, and we do have a lot of work to do to ensure that we can catch up and that we can continue to be able to both identify and also counter the threats that they posed. That said, we do have a very robust set of authorities, at least at CSE, as it relates to foreign intelligence mandate, our cybersecurity mandate, and furthermore, more recently in 2019, we were given the authority to conduct both defensive and active cyber operations, which I think added significantly to the tool set that Canada has in order to defend against these threats. We also have very robust partnerships with our Canadian colleagues in the security and intelligence community and across government, in addition to a robust partnerships with our Five Eyes and additional colleagues across the world. So I do think that we're well positioned to defend against these threats, but we do need to make sure that we are constantly evolving to match the threat because as you know, the cyber domain is increasing exponentially, and it is incumbent on us to ensure that we are constantly reviewing our authorities and our tactics in order to make sure that we can continue to defend Canadians. Merci.
Donc la réponse est ni oui ni non.
Thank you. So the answer is not yes or no, but it's important that we adapt to what's coming. Ms. Tessier, very quickly. Well, what I would add is that, indeed, there's a lot of information online. It's important to protect yourself. You have to be, a little bit suspicious sometimes with what you read and receive. You have to be aware of the threats out there and the information that you're publishing yourself online so that you don't become vulnerable. So it's a question of education and awareness because the actors are very sophisticated and use different techniques. Thank you very much. Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, I thank the folks that are here testifying. I really appreciate the work that you do, and I'm learning a lot today. I think as we're having this discussion, I can't help but just reflect on how important it is that voters and institutions need to be protected from any threat to democracy, and how important it is to continue that work. And I thank you for being part of it. So my question, and if I could come to Ms. Tayeb first, and Ms. Tezier, if you have anything you'd like to add, is in July 2021 update on threats to democracy, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity wrote that between 2015 and 2020, cyber threat activity was directed at voters more often than political parties in elections. So based on that information, how do you think an everyday Canadian should understand this? And I really hear what we're hearing is these threats are becoming more and more sophisticated. And what sort of action should voters take to ensure that they are viewing correct information about democracy in Canada?
Thank you very much for that question. It's excellent, and it's really core to how we see this threat, which is to really do our utmost to ensure that Canadians are aware of the threat, that they're aware of the tactics that are used, and that they know what to expect when they are viewing material online. And so that is in large measure why we've published the cyber threats to democratic institutions in previous years. The 2021 one was, I believe, our third one. So, our first line of defense is to ensure that Canadians have as much information as possible about the tactics that are used, the adversaries, that we name specific adversaries that we see most prolific in this space, and we outline the tactics that they use, including spreading, disinformation about the political process, sowing seeds, divisive seeds in our social media, and also casting, aspersions on the democratic process as a whole. And so we feel it's important that Canadians receive as much information about that as possible. We also we regularly reach out to Canadians through either media releases or through our Twitter in order to emphasize those messages as much as possible. Thank you very much.
So I appreciate that, but I also represent in my writing a lot of rural and remote communities that often have limited access to services. And so I'm just curious if there's any particular strategies or recommendations that you're providing for different community groups. So rural communities, remote communities that have limited access to connectivity, or looking at different groups across our country that are more marginalized. So I'm just wondering if there's specific strategies or recommendations around that, especially in terms of promoting democracy, because we know that sometimes these groups are the groups that don't participate in democracy as well, so as often, as fulsomely. So I'm just curious about that process.
I think it's an excellent question. It's one that we talk a lot about at CSE and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, is how to reach more Canadians, how to increase the reach of our media campaigns, how to ensure that we're reaching communities across Canada, including remote and northern communities. And we are developing ways to do that in a better way, but we do realize that there's a lot of work to do in that regard. Thank you.
So my next question is that, of course, when we look at this process, there has to be a balance between what we expect voters to do to inform themselves and understand, and how government should ensure that accurate information is available to the public. How do you envision this task being balanced between the two?
Perhaps I can start, and Alia can answer after that. I think a lot of it is awareness, and also communicating to Canadians, to various communities, that if there's any concern, if they see any information that they feel is questionable, if they feel threatened. I know our RCMP colleagues and other law enforcement partners are certainly available to address any potential threats. It's really very much an awareness issue of any questions or concerns that Canadians have, that they know that they can address them to ourselves, to the RCMP, to Elections Canada, and that we can answer those questions and create that awareness that people feel that they have the information they need and they're well informed when it comes to the elections and their ability to vote.
Thank you. I think all I was going to add to that is that, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Elections Canada, but I did work with them during the election campaign, and I'm aware that this is something that they are also seized with in improving their outreach to communities about the importance of participating in the democratic process. And so they may be able to offer more information on that as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've only got a couple seconds, so I will cede those ones. Thank you.
Thank you always, Mrs. Blaney. Next, we will go to Mr. Cooper, followed by Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Cooper, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the officials. I will direct my questions to whichever official is best positioned to answer my questions. The first question that I'll ask is, did the Chinese Communist regime interfere in the last federal election?
As I mentioned, I can't get into, as I'm sure you can appreciate, operational details of our investigations. But what I will say is that we know the Chinese Communist Party is involved and interested in promoting their own national interests. They are an actor in foreign interference, and we have said that publicly. And I can state again that we are concerned about the activities regarding threats against the security of Canada, including foreign interference by the Chinese Communist Party.
And I understand that you can't get into operational details, but could you speak perhaps a little more broadly about some of the activities that the Chinese Communist regime is involved in terms of interference?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we know China, amongst other countries, do try to target elected officials at all levels of government to promote their own national interests and to encourage individuals to speak or act, if you will, as proxies on behalf of the Communist Party of China. There is even open information that talks about these types of activities as well, and their use of proxy agents in other countries that they will use to represent their interests. So that remains of concern to us in terms of their influence activities and how they try to manipulate some of the individuals to work in their interests against Canada's national interests.
So, would it be fair to say that they're threatening and intimidating individuals on Canadian soil?
I think it's fair to say that they would use a number of techniques, including threats to communities here, including using proxy agents so that you don't necessarily know that it's the government of China that's behind it, including attempts to use community resources. So I would say it's fair to say that there are a number of techniques that they would use to promote their own national interests against Canada's.
And would it be fair to say that this is occurring on a fairly widespread basis?
I hesitate to give an actual frequency, but I would say that we are increasingly concerned. I think we have seen, as was mentioned earlier, the laws that the Chinese Communist Party has passed, making it obligatory for everybody in China, and including private sector, to work on behalf of the government. So I think we are seeing increasing authoritarianism, if I can allow myself to say that word, in terms of the Communist Party of China's strategies in this regard.
And can you speak to the use of Chinese language media by the regime?
We are concerned about the use of media by many of the hostile state actors, including China. We know that there are attempts, we've talked about disinformation and misinformation, attempts using all types of media, and media is very much a victim or is used, a tool that is used for foreign interference.
Content farms?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Content farms, content mills, information saturation?
I would say all available vectors in media would be able to be exploited, I guess, by hostile state actors. So all types of media are certainly vulnerable to exploitation.
Thank you. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to follow up actually on that line of questioning in terms of using media outlets. I believe, Ms. Tessier, you mentioned earlier that foreign state actors often use local media to spread disinformation or misinformation. You said just now in that exchange, paraphrasing here, of course, but that all types of media could be and would be used. So what would be CSIS or CNSE or any Canadian agency, for example, if a so-called media group like Canada Proud or Rebel News started using Chinese or Russian type disinformation in their local disinformation, misinformation campaigns? What mechanisms would you have to then tell Canadians that this local source of information is actually being used by foreign state actors like China, like Russia?
I want to highlight what we had said earlier, that we do respect, obviously, we are in a democracy, we respect media, and we do not want to be seen as interfering in media. So I do want to underline that. So that is certainly not an activity that the service would undertake. Without being able to get into great detail, we would look at, first of all, from an investigative perspective, to try to determine what the nature of the threat is. Of course, we would use the whole gamut of tools at our disposal. But I go back to the importance of working with the community and how important it is for us to work with stakeholders in the community to protect the community. And that's why it is important for community members to be able to reach out to us should they feel that this type of activity is going on. It is not certainly the service who will be monitoring all media, but, and I want to be careful here. We recognize the right to in a democracy to have that freedom of expression that exists. But we are concerned when our mandate is called into question, and that is when foreign interference, so hostile states working in a clandestine fashion, are working against Canadian national interests or threatening the community. So our mandate is quite defined in that respect, and I would want to reassure the committee that that is where our focus would be.
Thank you. And following up on that, isn't part of foreign state actors' attempts is to undermine democracy in places like Canada, and I'm sure in other countries as well, but it's to undermine democracy, our pillars of democracy, our trust in institutions, so that foreign interference and the messages that they send are not necessarily, oh, we like this person or this party or that party, but it's to actually sow doubt in our institutions. For example, I don't know, the bank or the governor of the Bank of Canada, the local media who ask tough questions of certain parties. Isn't it a factor that it's not very clear cut of we support this government over that government, but foreign interference is actually to sow doubt in our democratic institutions, and that could take form in many different messages?
You are absolutely correct. That is very much one of the vectors that are used, is to, as an example, try to find a divisive issue in society and amplify it one way or the other. So I'm pleased to say that the increased awareness and discussion about foreign interference, I think, highlights how society is becoming much more attuned to the threat that represents.
Did you see COVID as an opportunity? You mentioned to take a divisive issue and to turn that against governments. For example, Canada Proud was criticized for spreading misinformation about vaccine rollouts. And so did you see an increase in disinformation or sowing that doubt in Canadian society? Did you see that kind of that vacuum open or increase during COVID?
Again, focusing on our mandate. So if I look back to the threats to security of Canada, what we did see certainly during COVID was interest by hostile state actors to try to spread disinformation. We saw that from hostile state actors. We did also see attempts to conduct espionage and against some of the vaccine work that was being done. So we
Thank you.
undertook.
I'm sorry, that really flew by really fast, but the clerk is always so efficient. So I know it was 5 minutes. Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demi.
Ms. Goudreau, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The question will be very simple, and it is for Ms. Tessier. When you were talking about the importance of education and awareness, well, for our report's purposes, I would like to have your suggestions and your comments, of course. How can we go about this? You had reassured me, telling me about all the work you do upstream. So what can be done on this front? Thank you very much. In our public report, we described a number of techniques that are used by state actors who are hostile towards Canadian interests. For example, it's called cultivation. So these are individuals who offer gifts, for example, or paid trips, these types of things. Of course, cybersecurity is mentioned and how to protect oneself. What type of emails should raise suspicions. We also provide advice for a situation where an individual is being questioned about a number of subjects and wondering, am I giving too much information? So our report offers advice on the techniques that are used. And what I'm seeing, Madam Chair, is that there needs to be some more harmonization between the different departments who deal with these things like gifts and requests and raising awareness so that we can, accomplish this. So there is a preventive awareness situation, and we're experiencing this around harassment at the House of Commons. So in the near future, we should, not only the elected officials and staff, but also the greater public should be aware of this. So perhaps there's an additional comment from Ms. Tayeb on this? Yes, thank you. I could add something. When it comes to cybersecurity, we publish a lot of advice to a number of individuals on how to protect themselves. And just to give you a few examples.
People about ensuring that they use difficult to guess passwords, specifically, and Michelle mentioned the caution about.
Thank you. I was trying to help you get one out, but you can send the rest to us in writing through the clerk, because I'm sure Madame Goudreau and the committee would love to hear that. Mrs. Blaney, 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to leave this question open to both of you. I'll just let you decide who answers. What I'm seeing is an increase of misinformation on social media, and it just continues to grow and grow. And there's no longer that sort of debate about different opinions or perspectives, but more about debating the facts of reality, which I find really, really scary and concerning. And we know that there's reporting structures on social media sites. Twitter and Facebook, of course, are at the front line of complaints around this right now. So I'm just wondering, can companies who profit off engagement effectively stop the spread of disinformation? And how do we make sure in this country that that misinformation isn't being impacted by foreign interference, especially in terms of our elections?
Maybe I could start and then pass it to Michelle. It's an excellent question, and we have discussed that with actually members of social media companies. There are many of them with whom we have very robust relationships. It's in their business interest as well for their platform not to be used for nefarious purposes. And so for the most part, we have found excellent collaboration among our industry partners. There are certainly other online platforms with whom that are maybe hosted in other countries, and those with whom we don't have a relationship. Those are the ones where we, at least from a foreign perspective, insofar as they are in other countries, that we are actively looking to determine whether foreign governments are using those platforms in order to disseminate such information to Canada, and we then advise government about those threats, so that we can determine between, particularly in the case of election interference, which organization might be best placed to address that. We also at CSE are able to use active cyber operations if ever we were to find reasonable grounds to believe that a foreign government was using platforms to target Canadians. There would be ways that we could disrupt those activities. Thank you. Michelle?
I think you answered it well, Alia, and it is certainly one of the key topics during site discussions in terms of that type of activity that we see during electoral period, and who, as Alia pointed out, who is best placed to address them to the best of our ability.
Thank you so much. And we'll just do a quick one question, up to 2 minutes kind of time for Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. In the CSIS report entitled Foreign Interference Threats to Canada's Democratic Process, it's noted that some donors to political candidates may have a connection to foreign states and may be coerced into making donations, and that further, quote, political parties and candidates may receive funds seemingly from a Canadian, though this may have originated from a foreign threat actor, and threat actors can use someone as a proxy to conduct illicit financing activities on their behalf. Can you just elaborate on this? This is quite alarming, and do you have a sense of how much foreign money is being funneled in this way?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, I can't go into specifics about some of our investigations, but we do know that this is of concern, that this is a possibility, and we put it in our public report to bring awareness to this potential threat and how some hostile state actors are seeking to use funding. I can't go into the details of what we have done operationally, but I can say that it was of significant enough concern for us to put it in our public report to raise that awareness.
Do you have any recommendations on how to combat this threat?
Certainly, we would look at all the tools at our disposal, our investigative disposal, in terms of knowing if we do come across this type of activity, how we would address it, working with other stakeholders, creating awareness, raising it perhaps directly with an individual who may be unwitting to this type of information or this type of source of funding. So it really is looking at all the tools at our disposal to ensure that people are aware that this is occurring, and working as an example with the Office of the Commissioner of the Elections should this meet their mandate as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question goes to Mrs. Tayyib. Would you agree that many of Canada's policing agencies and intelligence agencies have traditionally had a blind spot for right-wing extremism, and that has now been revealed through what has occurred on Capitol Hill, and even with the commission that we're seeing for the convoy, whether they are foreign actors or sometimes a mix of foreign and domestic, which becomes quite confusing. I know our terrorism, some of the threats to Canada's terrorism reports have been revised over the years to include some of these threats more recently, but traditionally they weren't necessarily investigated to the extent that we are trying to catch up to today.
Thank you very much for that question. I can speak on behalf of CSE. Certainly any Ideologically motivated violent extremism would be something that we would actively, that originates from foreign sources would be, and directed towards Canada would be something that we would be looking at. And we have been active in that space for a very long time. I think with respect to the first part of your question, I wouldn't be in a position to comment on sort of police forces or security agencies. I know that we all take threats to Canadians very seriously, and that's been my experience in the community.
In terms of what distinguishes foreign interference from legitimate international diplomacy, could you maybe distinguish the characteristics of the two? Because some of the stuff that we've heard today, perhaps there's a lot of overlap that sometimes is used domestically here on the ground by different countries.
Indeed, I can start off with that, and I'll pass it over to Michelle as well. But from our perspective, indeed, there are many legitimate diplomatic activities that are undertaken by nation states with respect to Canada, where we qualify it as interference or influence is when that activity is covert nature, it's deceptive in nature, it's against the activities trying to be undertaken or to influence Canadian decision makers in a way that is contrary to Canadian national interest.
Thank you. I do appreciate the information, and I would really ask, because I've had to interrupt so many times, that if you can take the time to provide us some of that information that was requested to the clerk, I believe members would really benefit from it for the purpose of the study. I do also want to just appreciate the way the both of you have worked together in providing answers. It's, I think, the first visual I've had as to how well our partners actually can work together. So I do want to thank the both of you for taking the time to be with us today, and I look forward to seeing more from you through the clerk that will be shared with all members. So with that, I wish the two of you a good day. For PROC committee members, Thursday, so today the recommendations for the precinct study are due by 5 o'clock to the clerk. Thursday we will resume with witnesses on this study. On Friday by noon we are asking for hybrid study recommendations to the clerk in both official languages. Vendredi midi, oui. And then we would be headed into a constit week. And I think there is some desire to want to see a subcommittee actually meet for the first time, which is probably what we'll try to do on the Thursday when we return from constituency week. And then we'll make our plan accordingly. Yes, Mrs. Blaney.
Thursday or Tuesday when we return?
Tuesday, November 15th. Sorry, I get so excited. And just through the constit week, please stay tuned as reports will be coming to you. And we will make sure that teams have about a week with the report prior to us getting into drafting at this committee, so everyone has time to read it. Lots of information. Happy Tuesday. Have a good day.